coordination with Marquette University. And what we wanted to do was, so you guys know this, I think everybody in this country knows this, that firearms are like on any given day, a top 3 subject that's written about, and oftentimes like the top subject. And so, but we felt like, could we say something different and new? And so what we started to get into was really trying to look at the issue and maybe change the lens a little bit. And I'll just tell you a little bit about how we did that. We sort of looked at Wisconsin particularly. That's where I am. And the Journal Sentinel circulates in Wisconsin. We wanted to look at data across the state, focusing on firearms deaths, but not the ones that we in the media most often focus on, which would be homicides, accidentals or negligence, and police-involved shootings, but to include suicides. And look at that in a rigorous way, in a collection of data way. The other thing that was really clear, and the way I came to you guys, was I started to learn as I went through the reporting for that collection of data, how much was happening within and among firearms owners, specifically to talk about the issue of mental health and suicide prevention. And so that really led into talking to dozens of gun owners and folks in Wisconsin about this issue, and a series of profiles came out from that. So the project launched, and we wrote about the Gun Shop Project, which you guys are all, I know, aware of in your audience, which we have that here in Wisconsin. So it was sort of a dual track project that was focused on data, but also really the lived experience, the experiences of gun owners around the issue, specifically of mental health.
I thought Mike was leaning in. Sorry. This is right up our alley, which is really cool because we have just beat the drum for years now saying, homicides are unfortunate, but that's not the bulk of why people die by gun. And you took this on, which I think we very much appreciate, to give a new light to a broader audience about the serious nature of what constitutes the vast, overwhelming majority of gun deaths. I don't know if it's vast at this point, but it's definitely the overwhelming majority of gun deaths. And you did so in a very tactful manner, which isn't common. Talk a little bit about that too, because I know that you've got some accolades for that, or at least a shout out on your, on the thing that you sent us, the little internal discussion forum for journalists looking to do things the right way. So talk a little bit about that, and that way we can stop talking inside baseball for everybody.
That's right. So I appreciate that. I mean, when you talk about the majority, in Wisconsin, of every 100 gun deaths, 71 are suicide. 25 are homicide, 2% are law enforcement involved, and 1 is accidental. The balance are undetermined. So 71%, and that's over more than 20 years. So that's a number that moves up and down, a little bit higher than the national average, which is in the mid 50s. But a national average is really kind of crude because it's 50 states all kind of put together. But, it's more than half. And in Wisconsin, it's 71%. When we got into this, I actually, at the beginning, I had some trepidation about putting the deaths together, because I thought that would actually lead to pushback. It has a little bit, but not. I thought there would be more pushback because we would be sort of putting together deaths that had very different sort of origins behind them, and that there might be, specifically among gun owners, pushback to say, hey, that's not really an authentic way. So I found it very interesting when you brought in that this is a conversation that you guys have been leaning into, and others that I really wasn't aware of. And again, I've written about this sort of thing to some degree for years and years. And so I just want to say that before I start talking about how other coverage has been done, because I don't want to be in a position of casting shade on other reporters in a way that feels shaming, because that's sort of what this project is trying to do, is get away from a shaming sort of tone and have a more even-handed way to look at this. And you mentioned there was a sort of inside group called Trusting News. They is a journalism group or internal group that encourages journalists to use less polarizing language, and language that is more explanatory. And, part of that, as I got into this, and I was working through Marquette University, and I talked with Dave Umhafer, was the director over there. My editor on this was Greg Borowski, and the genesis of this came from my former boss, George Stanley, who retired. And each one of them, as I talked about it, said, hey, can we write about this in a different way? And the thing that I started to do, and that's where the name of the series came from, is seeing people's humanity first. And the big thing was getting away from some of what I call catchphrases. Because I learned early on in journalism that, and I found it really clearly here, that those terms are not always universally held. And the problem is that in my business, if you're communicating something, it'd be sort of like me writing in French, but people don't know French. Like if I'm using a phrase that people could not understand or they receive differently, and I'll give you an example, gun violence. Like that's pretty widely used. That's pretty widely understood differently, as I found. Responsible gun owner. That's again a term that is widely used and understood, differently. And so what I had an editor early on in my career say, if it's unclear, use more words, be more descriptive. So if instead of using gun violence, which we don't use in the project, we talk, and I use specifically gun deaths. And I talk about specific, because, for some people, gun violence would be a shooting only, fatal or non-fatal. But, pointing a firearm at somebody could feel like gun violence. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's use of force for law enforcement. So we started to get sort of curious and slow it down. And that, part of that, the fellowship, which I worked on for a year, allowed me, sort of the gift of time to really think a little bit more deeply. And you guys really helped shape that. You and others helped shape that, some different thinking about that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Sorry, Jake. I'm a question about, so when I say my people, I'm talking about the 2A community, right? My people. We tend to think that we never will get a fair shake in the media, right? And that's one of the reasons why I was so happy that your article got picked up like by the USA Today, because it was for me, it was like one of the first times I could just like throw it in people's faces, like, yeah, the liberal media, like you always hear that from our side. It's like, I've always said, if you come with solutions, instead of just like saying, hey, it's a mental health issue, there's nothing we can do, it's a mental health issue, then I think more media would listen, right? Because my experience with the media has been pretty positive so far. And Jake, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've ever really been sandbagged or anything like that.
No.
Yeah. Even the San Jose State thing turned out positive in our favor, and I think they were setting us up to sort of
to step on ourselves. Yeah,
exactly. But what's your thoughts on that? Like, how do you see it, right? Like, how do you see it the same way we sort of see it? When I say we, obviously I'm talking about the 2A community, or do you see?
It's so as I look at it, again, if I was trying to get away from some shaming language, I'm also highly like aware of that in my own community, right? So like sometimes I call us the 1A community, right? So First Amendment. But
hell yeah, brother.
but part of it is experience, lived experience, right? I mean, people don't sort of like disclose whether they own firearms in a newsroom, but you gather that that's not as common, that the majority, or it's a minority. I'm not a gun owner currently. I think that's actually going to change in the not too distant future because of some family issues and some passing on and things of that nature. But somebody died, but I talked about that. But we're, as journalists, that's what we're trained to do, is come into community and understand that there are different understandings and experiences in communities that we don't necessarily have experience. I think this particular issue causes, it's emotional, very emotional, especially when events happen, and they could be smaller events, a single death that is particularly tragic at the suicidal or other homicidal level and so forth, and some larger events. And I think what has happened is maybe some, how do I say this? Some just sort of unconscious blind spots have come in, and they've sort of taken hold, and they've been reinforced, and to to sort of challenge those, but not in a harsh way, but in a way that is that is curious and inquisitive, has felt different to people. And I've heard this from a wide range of people. Now, the reaction is pretty broad to this project. Some of it has been negative, and that's both from people who are anti-gun and some in the 2A community. There has been some of that, but that's a minority compared to the positive reaction that I've received. And that positive reaction is certainly from the 2A community, people who are maybe wouldn't identify as 2A but are gun owners, and then also people who are not gun owners who may be gun, as you say, gun neutral or anti-gun people too. Like, there are people who have emailed me and said, I am like totally opposed to guns. They should not be legal. And yet you've given me something to think about. And so I think that's what, and my editor at the beginning of the story of this project started with my boss, George Stanley, who's since retired. He's a gun owner, hunter for a long time, many decades, said, John, I think there's another story here. And I think you're the one to tell it because your background in reporting, having covered the military and law enforcement, a familiarity not only with firearms, but also with those communities, that I think you're the right person to tell it. And so, in a way, it felt like I was coming into a story that is, or an area of reporting that's sort of in plain view. It's so obvious to me now that there was a good opportunity here. But as one of my colleagues said, he said other reporters have not seen it. Not everybody. I know there's been some reporting around this. And so I don't want to say like we discovered the, like sort of the atom here or something, like other reporters have done some of this. I've seen some of this, and it still feels fresh to people. That's what I'm hearing. And that has been, my friend, he's like, you're not going to hear a lot of footsteps on that story because other reporters don't see that story. And I didn't see it at the beginning. That's my editor had to sort of like, it was sort of a story I had to sort of squint to see. And once I got in, and once the gun owners, gun owners, not only, it was one of the questions at the beginning, would gun owners talk to me? Yes, like lots. And that sounds sort of absurd now, but I don't know. It just snowballed, and and one led to another. Maybe it was some of the approaches, but once I was understanding some of the nuance and complexity within and among gun owners, I was like, wow, this is a super rich area to write about, and including the mental health piece, which I had no idea that was even a discussion, like what you guys are doing and others are doing in this space. I just was, again, like just didn't know, and was really grateful to be able to be led into those and people to trust me with their stories.
I really want to hear more about the journalistic angle of this because some of you know that I have an undergrad in journalism, so it's very near and dear to my heart. But Brandon has a question first. I can get back to this later when we talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I was just wondering because it sounds like it's for like what you've written, and it seems like you really took a lot of time to like be careful with the wording that you use. But you mentioned that you still did get a little bit of backlash. So I was just wondering, like, where did that backlash come from, and what were some of the arguments that you were getting?
Well, I think that part of the thing that people, a couple of the comments, and again, it's sort of like we, I think, okay, so early on in the project, I talked to, as I mentioned, I covered the military, and I talked to a guy that I know who I was deployed with him a couple of times as embedded media. And so he's a retired Army officer, intelligence officer. And so he said, John, part of your problem is in the media is that you guys highlight the unusual and you suppress the usual. And I'm like, yeah, that is true. Like, man bites dog is a story, dog bites man is not a story. The problem with that is that gives the impression that, man bites dog is the more common thing that happens, right? So the impression is that these things which are unusual, which by their unusualness are newsworthy, might create the impression in some people's minds that those are usual. And so part of this, as I went through this, was some of the pushback was, well, and on the issue of mass shootings, which I don't really use that phrase either, because I think there's another term Sebastian Junger uses called rampage shootings, which feel a little bit more accurate at it. But the project really built a fence, and that was outside of it, because it falls into those particular kinds of events, fall into the homicide numbers. And really homicide ended up not being as big of a part of this. And that was part of the criticism, is that possibly by highlighting one thing, which was the suicide, surfacing that big number of 71%, are you de facto suppressing or diminishing the other deaths, which are highlighted more usually, which would be the homicide and so forth. And I was really conscious of that, especially in community in Milwaukee, where I said where homicide numbers have been up, and this is a burden that has landed very hard on particular communities. We're in among some, maybe the most, say, statistics, but among the most segregated cities in the United States. Black Milwaukeeans feel this a lot harder than anyone else in our community. And we write about it a lot. And I was very conscious of that when we went into that, to say, would I be suppressing that story? Would I be suppressing a negligent or accidental discharge story? Would I be suppressing a school shooting by elevating suicide? So I tried to go to some effort to be clear about that. And I think for some people, it still felt like you can't write about this without acknowledging some of those categories more. And I guess I sort of came back from like, there is a what our story was, and this issue is broad, and we can't cover everything deeply. I did try to speak into that, but it's a really good question. And that was, and I responded to all those people. I mean, the other thing that we had, the follow-on piece, was we polled gun owners in Wisconsin, deepest, most extensive poll of gun owners in Wisconsin. And we also featured gun owners. We had a series of features, and people talked about, different reasons why they have, firearms. Some carry, some don't. Why? That sort of thing. And some of those features rubbed a couple people wrong. Among gun owners, I think there was, as I recall, there were a couple people who felt like, talking about suicide and gun, ownership was anti-gun, and was sort of raising this issue of, I guess, Rob Pincus talks about like no negative outcome type of maybe thing. I mean, I know that not the term that the people who emailed me said, but sort of like saying like that's really not the gun's fault, and you're making it sound like it is. It's sort of that sort of was some of the thing from the, I guess, from 2A community, if that's fair to say.
Yeah, I had that before you go, Eddie. I had that happen to me during a speech in Washington on the Hill. Like we were outside of the building, and somebody wrote, like, literally as I started off my speech, I had to do like 6 minutes, and I was like, I think a minute in, and someone in my circle of crew, like my gun people, yelled out, "Why do you keep blaming the gun?" And I was like, whoa, slow down. And it just threw the whole speech off. But yeah, I can see that, why people associate blame. For some reason, we associate blame with having this discussion about it, and I think it's because we're so used to it being used against us for many, many years in the industry, right? That was the whole thing. You can't talk about this stuff because they use it against you. They just twist it, the they. But anyways, Eddie, go ahead.
So speaking of the they, kind of a two-part question, but like you said that you got some pushback saying like you can't elevate talking about gun suicide without highlighting these other things because it's taking away stuff. Was this like a high-profile people, or just like just emails and stuff you were getting? The reason I'm kind of asking that is sometimes people have slight agendas. I'm not trying to like say someone will asking a legitimate question as an agenda. I'm just curious, was it like a lot of people, or is it like certain organizations coming at you? And the second part of the thing, not even with that, that was like you said, you polled all the people in your state. Is the results of this survey available for everyone, or is it like, was it a closed survey that just you guys have? Because I'd be interested to see this information. I think a lot of different like gun organizations would as well, including mental health organizations.
Yeah. So, yeah, good questions. This is a small number of people. And again, it's sort of like I'm talking about highlighting the unusual. I mean, compared to the positive notes, and actually, let me just talk about a couple of those positive notes, because I think they really bear, and then I'll answer your question. A couple of my emails, I mean, it just blew me away. I mean, there were people who were like, sharing stories of people who have in their families had lost people to suicide with a gun or not. Just some really heartfelt, appreciative messages. There also was a guy who does interventions. He's a retired Army Sergeant Major Mike Essinger out of Green Bay. And he received 5 phone calls in the weeks after this story of people who were contemplating ending their life. He gets these calls all the time because he was in the Army Reserves and overseas, and he's sort of the go-to guy. And all of those had good outcomes. All of those ended up with people self-admitting and all gun owners who secured their firearms in a secure place during that help. So some really positive stuff. On the critical side, and again, people were like, I mean, there was some tough. I mean, that's part of our business, right? So, like, I know it gets stuff out there. Sometimes it gets a little toxic or very toxic, but it's part of what we do. But I always feel like engaging people. If somebody takes the time to write to me, I'm going to write back. And I don't know that the people were representing. They didn't represent as part of an organization. Actually, I mean, I did hear back from groups like Everytown Brady and so forth, who really appreciated the series. And some wanted to reach out like to a gun store owner that I featured who was close to ending his life and didn't, and is helping other people now. But the individuals were, basically feeling like, I don't know, I think it was just really hard for them to get their head wrapped around this different paradigm or framework to look at, and they could not stop seeing these issues like saying you need to talk to the families from Uvalde. That should be part of your series. And I like they took the time to give me feedback, and I totally appreciate that. And like, with all due respect, that wasn't exactly this story. We did talk, we referenced a little bit of that in the story, but that wasn't particularly this piece. On the poll, yes, all the results of that are online, and it was sort of the third piece of this project. The first piece was a gun shop project piece. We sort of led with the solutions piece. A lot of times what we do in journalism is we quote lead with the quote unquote problem, and then I just give you guys the insight of how it works in our journalism world. We sort of go problem, and then often late in the project they'll sort of like throw up a solution story, right? So we call it the solution story. That's a little cynical way to put it, but sometimes the solution story feels kind of like a caboose, right? So in this case, that's the engine. Like, we started with a solution story, which was Chuck Lovelace in Park Falls, who started the gun shop project in Wisconsin. It's 40 plus gun shops now, and it's just doing some amazing grassroots work. No government involvement. There has been some bills proposed, but nothing's passed. And so we led with that. The third part was the poll. And you can go online and look. It was 354 gun owners. We have estimated more than 1 million gun owners in Wisconsin. So it's not statistically representative of our population. Just be really clear about that. But there are some mental health questions. We talked about, do you know a gun owner who has considered suicide or, voiced that? That was 20%, which is a big number when you think about the subject. And it's probably an undercount, I think. It's a not majority number, but it's a big number when you think about the subject. The other about same number, 20%, was how many gun owners have held guns for other people. And we're not in a 100% background check state, so you can do that without a transfer being initiated. So neighbors, things like that, family members who would hold guns. And of course, the Gun Shop Project allows that process as well. But most of the other stuff that we asked about were some of the things that you guys asked about in your survey too, about storage, about what kinds of firearms people own. We talked about the pandemic. We talked about concealed carry. What percentage of people who actually have permits actually carry, defensive gun use, things like that.
The stats you highlighted there, if people want to look them up, the article is called Poll of Wisconsin Gun Owners Shows Storage Habits, Reasons for Buying. And I really appreciated that follow-up because people are afraid of data, I think, on all sides of the issue because they're afraid that the data may not back their predetermined narrative. And in one of the articles, you linked to the oft recited Harvard study that people really point to say presence of guns increases more gun suicides. And so the people who want to control guns tend to point to that and say, this is why we should control guns, because even when you're talking suicides, there's more suicides with, presence of guns. But also deeper in that research, gun owners don't have more suicidal ideation than non-gun owners. They don't have more mental health problems than non-gun owners. They're not, more prone. But what it's highlighting, I think, is that access is the issue, and we've been hammering that since the inception of the organization, which is why we do the Cause of Pause campaign. Create time and space so that if in a critical incident or a critical moment, you can push through the impulse by putting a mechanical separation or a psychological separation between you and the execution of that impulse. And so, back to G-Webs had a comment on the YouTube channel. He says, suicide's 2/3 the number. And actually in our most recent data, it's 2021 has been finalized and it's like 54%, but that's only because homicides spiked in 21. But it's fluctuated between, now it's 54, which is the lowest percentage it's been for probably 20 years, and about 62%. And like you said, John, it varies by geography and region. So that's the national average. And in Wyoming, where we just came from, that number's closer to 75% of all gun deaths are suicides. So, talking about this is not, like G-Web says, it's not diminishing the other deaths. It's calling attention to something that has previously been, I think, glossed over because it's so radioactive or perceived to be radioactive. And we're proving that it's not radioactive. However, I think that, as you know, because you're somebody who writes for a living and publishes regularly, whenever you cover something, you will invariably get people who say, why didn't you cover this? Or please cover this other thing, because to them, that's important. And to them, their perspective is that it ties in. And that's totally legit. However, we're time limited and we're character limited. And so maybe someday down the road, not that, it's been talked to death, because I don't think you can talk about getting out in front of people who are mentally ill and unstable, perpetrating violence enough. I don't think you can ever do that enough. But to your point, your mission on this story was not Uvalde. It was this. And so trying to be respectful of that is very, very challenging. And I think often it leads people to paralyze into not wanting to write something that maybe they need to lend a voice to, simply because they don't want the pushback on all the other stuff. You do that once, you get scorched, once, and you don't want to write or publish again. And I've talked to enough people who've written books and articles and done presentations, and I've certainly done plenty myself, where you always get somebody in the audience who goes, well, what about this? Well, that wasn't part of the presentation, right? Like, that's a different presentation for a different time. So I really appreciate the nuance and the thoughtfulness that went into this. And I'm really glad that you and your staff and your team were so thoughtful about it. And I want to ask how much self-censorship or hesitation went into this. And if you had some, how did you push through it, or did you not? Because I know that's an issue for anybody who writes or produces.
Yeah, I appreciate everything you're saying there. I think it was challenging as I sort of think back to. It's hard to go back in time to think back. Well, how did I think, a year ago or even 2 years ago? Because really the genesis of this was 2 years ago. That's when I pitched it, and I started it in August of 2022, and sort of the fellowship ran through, all through last year. So I say in this reporter's notebook, and I should say probably the easiest way to find the URL is if you just type in Journal Sentinel or Journal Sentinel Milwaukee and behind the gun, right? So that's the phrase, and that should pull up. And there's a project page where you have all the pieces. There's like, I don't know, 16 different pieces, and the poll, and all these profiles and so forth. The piece on you guys is all there. But yeah, at the beginning, I started off in the reporter's notebook saying the story was not my idea. And I'm really fortunate to work at a place where most of the things I do are my idea. Like, I come up with the idea, I do investigations, and off we go. So I've done different things, over the years. This was one that my editor came to me, as I said, and pitched. And I was like, I was sort of, because I talked to I talked to our outdoor writer, and he's like, boy, I don't know, like every time I write, he writes about hunting, but every time something comes up about access or whatever, it blows up huge. And I just don't even bring it up with my sources. See, so like, and then I looked at our paper and I said, okay, so how do we write about firearms? We write about like hunting in the sports section, totally cool, right? All day about guns over there. We do that all the time. And then we write about, things like homicides. We write a lot about accidents, which, again, not to diminish those, but to understand statistically in Wisconsin and nationally, but in Wisconsin, it's 1%. Now, they're particularly tragic and maybe intervenable in a way. They are, in a way, intervenable that is different than homicide, suicide, and police-involved shootings. See, so like each one of them doesn't have like a simple solution. And I love that. There's a comment from a retired cop, Jean Papalia from Madison. And she said that, and Jean's quite liberal. I mean, she got like rid of her guns the day she retired from the police force. She's not a gun owner anymore, but this is her area that she got into. She said, this is the biggest area. Suicide is the biggest issue, and I want to help in that area. But she said, resist the temptation to go with the simple solution. She said, a lot of legislators will say, here's the thing, on both sides, on either side. Here's the one thing. She's like, it's more complicated than that. Let's lean into the complexity and the nuance. And so, when I started to look at what we cover, I started to realize we just don't cover suicide. And the reason we don't cover suicide is because of ideation. And just because, I think there's a long idea of like, this is bound to happen if somebody's determined to do it, that sort of line, which we know the statistics do not back that up, that in fact, that if time and space is interjected in that the outcome is statistically rare, that somebody will, take their life in the end. And also that, the lethality of firearms are something to factor in when you think about the different means, right? So these are things you guys read about, like, and I wrote about, I started to understand, I'm like, okay, so could we write about this in a curious and not, judging way? And it challenged me, so like, my experience with guns, I grew up, I didn't grow up with a gun in the home, but in a way, my dad and his dad, they lived out in a rural kind of part of Milwaukee County, 20 acres. And there was a 22 that my dad grew up with hunting pheasant when he was a kid in the 50s. And there was a shotgun there. And occasionally we would go out and shoot. It's funny because at the beginning, I didn't really think about, growing up around guns, but I did for the times that I would go and stay with my dad. My parents were not together. So I had that experience and had some understanding of that. It wasn't as rich as some people that I've talked to about hunting. But I also had to like continue to challenge myself and think about where are my biases, especially ones that I was not aware of that could be slowing me down. And I had a really interesting conversation with a guy named John Roman, who's with NORC. That's the National Opinion Research Group out of Chicago. And they did a piece a couple years ago about guns. But John said something, and he said, this might get my liberal credentials pulled, but here I'm going to go anyway. And he said, there's like 400 million guns in this country. And he said, yeah, there's a lot of negative outcomes, but it's a minority when you think of the overall number of firearms. So he said, what's not happening? Right. And there's different reasons why things are not happening. Some of it is, maybe dumb luck. Some of it is very thoughtful care. Some of it is, maybe something else. But he said, what can we learn from what's not happening? And that might help inform these outcomes that we want to try to intervene with. Again, understanding that these different outcomes are complex and it isn't a simple, one solution push. And that kind of rocked my world, because, that's a statistical thing. If you guys know that there's this phrase that I learned kind of late in my journalism career called the null hypothesis, which is like, what is not happening? And if you can understand a little bit about that, then you can kind of get over to the other side and say like that's the heartland of statistics. But it's really helpful to say, it's like studying the place where something is not happening. And can we understand why, what things are in place there that are contributing possibly to what's not happening, and how could that help inform when something is happening?
I love that we're talking about this, because I've said for a couple of years now, and I'm getting a little louder about it, that the problem in my estimation is that politicians who have to run for office periodically, they want to be able to trot something out in front of their constituents to show that they did something, and put that in air quotes, right? I did something. And that something is often the blunt instrument that we've addressed here. It's not a very precise way of dealing with the thing. And this thing that we're talking about here is firearm deaths, but it could be environmental change, or it could be, taxation or whatever. So I think that the solution then, because I'm not a fan of pointing out problems without, offering a solution, the solution to the political expedience is to convince politicians and those who are running for elected office to slow down and try to convince their constituents that instant gratification is not where it's at. We have to if we want to do root cause mitigation, which Laura Smith talked about on a previous podcast, we have to address the longitudinal solutions. And those longitudinal solutions often are very nuanced. And so if we look at the pie chart of firearm deaths, for example, we know that we'll just call it 60%. 60% are suicides, 30% are homicides, the rest are negligent, undetermined, law enforcement, whatnot. So each of those slices of the pie needs its own solution. And I'm not a fan of legislating it away. And the reason I'm not a fan of legislating it away, because I don't think it works. But I think if we dove into the weeds and got our elected officials to dive in with us, they would see that is the case. And they would probably start steering more toward education and more promotion. In fact, to tie this together, I just read an article yesterday about how Nevada has something like 200,000 abandoned mines. It's crazy. And Nevada was famous for mining back in the 1800s. Of those 200,000 abandoned mines, about 50,000 are determined to be dangerous or unsafe. And half of those have been identified. And of those half, only a very small percentage have actually been closed up, caved in, walled off, whatever. So we've got a problem with abandoned mines here, and people exploring them and meeting untimely demises. But what's interesting is that because the state office that deals with that doesn't have the tens of millions of dollars that it needs, or hundreds of millions of dollars that it needs to fix the actual physical mine structure, what they did back in the late 90s and early 2000s, they launched a media campaign that says, abandoned mines, stay out, stay safe. Yeah, or stay safe, stay out, however it's phrased. And since doing that, the number of incidents of people, pets, whatever, dying or needing to be rescued from mines has dropped precipitously. In fact, I don't think we've had one since like 2014. And before that, it was like 2007. And before that, it was like 1999. But before that, it was like one a year or something. So we know that education works if it rises to a public health level. The problem is the gun owners hear, public health crisis of gun deaths, and they think gun grabbing, right? But I'm actually hopeful that I think if we get if it must be a legislative solution, then I think that solution should be funding toward education in the form of billboards and PSAs and more mental health awareness, for example, in order to steer away from the control issue and more toward the self-education angle, because I think that will actually work. But we've got to get the electeds to understand that the quick and easy it's neither quick nor is it easy, and it doesn't even work, right? So I'm curious if you have had I don't know if you do any political coverage, because I know you're an investigative guy, and I want to go around the horn and see what everybody else thinks on this. I know my opinion, obviously, I just shared it. But What do you guys think? Like, start with John. Do you see that as an option, or are we just too locked into, next election cycle, raise funds, dazzle people with, nonsense?
Well, it's after a big project like this, often what we do, just to kind of follow along what a sort of a approach that reporters will do, is we'll call legislators and see, like, well, what do you think about this? Is this something that you might step into? I think of some of the investigations. I didn't do that in this case, and like exactly 0 people have called me, which is sort of interesting when you think about the depth of what we did here. No legislators have called me at all, either Republican or Democrat. I find that kind of interesting because it seems to me, and what's also interesting is we have a pretty divided state. We're sort of that, one of those bellwether states in Wisconsin, and pretty like purple. Like sometimes we go Democrat, sometimes we go Republican. And what was interesting to me is, like, going back into this reporting, I learned that, the 2 most powerful Democrats and Republican in the state, Robin Vos and Governor Evers, both supported, this gunshot project. They both supported suicide prevention. Those 2 guys agree on nothing ever. They're at each other's throats all the time. Now, the bill itself, the gunshot project, was a bipartisan bill, which is highly unusual in Wisconsin. Even more unusual, is like a unicorn unusual, is a bipartisan gun bill in Wisconsin. Like that almost never, ever happens. The last time was some training requirements around CCW, I guess. So doesn't ever happen. And even with all that support, that bill did not pass. Now, what that bill would have done was funding some safes for stores and things like that. There's some reasons why it didn't pass. But when I looked at it, I thought, if that can't pass, and there might be something that'll come back this year, we'll see. But I started to think differently than just a government solution. And then go back to what Gene was talking about in Madison, that it's a complex thing in terms of like grassroots stuff, things that are happening already. And those things are happening. Like for us, the gunshot project happened and launched prior to that. It does have government encouragement because the VA is involved, but it doesn't have a government mandate behind it. And so I think for me, it's broadening the idea. Even the piece that I'm working on right now is the impact from the series. And we're measuring impact differently. The impact is about these 5 phone calls of people who are, in crisis, and there were good outcomes. A good impact is the gun shop owner that I know who's now partnering with a domestic violence group in northern Wisconsin. We're talking about right now having a mental health forum geared toward gun owners in the northern part of Wisconsin later this year. So there are different kinds of outcomes. And I think you're right on there may be some roles for legislators to play in that, but to sort of go through, here's our list, follow this list. This is like what we know need to happen, and plug and play. The evidence is that that's not going to move. It's certainly not going to move here in Wisconsin. But, are there, like, I think it's really interesting as there's discussions. We don't have a red flag law here. And yet there's discussions around the issue. So take away the title or the label and talk about the issue. Because sometimes that title comes in and it tends to bring out a strong reaction. But talk about the issue of that and take away, the title that I guess came up from a different place. And so I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it's more like all of this. It's more complicated than simply coming out, having a press conference and saying, here's the points or what need to happen to sort of address this.
Yeah, before Brandon goes, I think to your point, the title, I think, sounds like a non-consensual solution. Then so people just bristle at it. It's like you hear that thing that was pushed somewhere else, and it's like, oh, you're talking about that thing again. Well, I'm automatically and obviously going to be opposed to it. So yeah, you're right. We do have to find different ways. Brandon?
Yeah, I was just going to say, similar to what you guys said, it's kind of like, a lot of times people are trying to cut the head off to fix the headache. And there's just a lot more that we need to do for that. Like if we're really trying to solve, gun deaths, it's kind of looking at where's the biggest piece of that, puzzle. Suicide seems to be the biggest one, followed by homicides. And then from there, there's like different sub categories that you could get into. Clover Tech just mentioned, don't forget that 30% can be broken down to a lot of gang violence related stuff, which is way different issue than other homicides, which require different fixes. So all that to say, I mean, it's not just like a one fix solution.
Yeah, when it comes to politicians, WTTA's history has been really interesting. I've had politicians reach out. I've actually flown and met with people, but it seems to never go anywhere. And we kind of lump like, okay, that's government. But then again, I think about like our work with the VA and the DOD. Like they're very interested in what we do, but I've never been able to figure out what it is. And I've had both Democrat and Republicans reach out, what it is that stops the conversation from moving forward, especially sometimes when they get super excited about what Walk the Talk America does. I don't know if at the end of the day, it's like they go back to some think tank and they're just like, hey, like, no, I don't get this, or I don't understand this, or this guy is from the gun industry or whatever. I don't know what kills it. But I'm kind of shocked that we haven't been pushed more to the forefront with politicians, especially Republicans, right? Like that are pro-gun, that could go up there and say like, okay, here's the solutions that we want to offer. I don't know what it is. I've never understood it.
Some of it, I think, is just the jadedness that some people say, Republicans aren't really pro-gun; they just use it to get elected. And I mean that. The other thing that you're looking into, though, with all this stuff is that what I think might need to happen is kind of like the cultural revolutions that you saw out of the 60s and stuff. And it's not going to be a top-down fix. It's going to have to come from the bottom. The people are going to have to change things, which, right now we're in the status quo of just look at our politicians. Most of them are over the age of 60. And so they're ingrained. They're not going to change things, because to change things means real work. And kind of, why do you want to do real work when you can just do the status quo and have your cushy life? And that's, again, kind of a negative view of American politics, but that is in a way how things are heading in certain regards. But as far as like a real change goes, the grassrootsness of these organizations is becoming effective. Now, as like Mike, you said, like you've talked to politicians. I know during our last election cycle here in North Carolina, when it was actually our congressional representative, I talked to a bunch of them on both sides, and they were all really interested, but not enough to do anything about it, because it's not the sexy thing to tout. Like the sexy thing to tout is, from my cold dead hands on the Republican side, or we're going to ban AR-15s from the Democrat side, or what have you. And it's like real long-term fixes, which actually does help things. And the gang violence of looking into actually where the problems are and actually fixing certain problems isn't a sexy fix. And in that regard, it's kind of hard to believe that the politicians are going to jump in on this. And so that's where the other organizations have to force their membership to force the politician, in a sense, if that all makes sense.
I'm going to speak on DB's behalf because he's getting glitchy. But first, I'll say something that G-Web says. Red flag laws are less about the name than the idea that just taking one dangerous thing away from people in crisis is some kind of solution. And the obvious focus is on removing guns only. It's obvious. And Clover Tax is my answer to Mike's question. What kills it is they go back and see the loss in their election costs by fixing stuff. And that's the cynicism, right? Is, if you lose donations because you're actually working toward something real, that threatens your reelection. And honestly, in the two-party system, it threatens your fundraising ability to help other candidates too, because money gets shuffled around from the big gun fundraisers to other people. And DB says, his 2 cents is political measures related to firearms seem to be couched in quote unquote safety terms and we obviously have done I think a pretty good job of pushing back on the safety language and changing gun ownership from safety terms to responsible, so that we're taking personal accountability. He says many of those who propose them are clear in their desire to remove firearms from the public, which is parenthetically a full stop to the Second Amendment, and it's a non-starter. He doesn't have a lot of faith that those solutions being brought are quote unquote common sense, because it's like sense goes out the window when emotion gets involved, and we have an entire podcast describing that. And I don't want to beat this into the ground. I'd like to shift back to the journalism aspect of this. You said something earlier on, John. It was a term called seeing the story. And I would like for you to share what that means. And with the lay audience that's listening, like, I don't think they quite understand that when you're reporting on something, there are so many angles, and to not see it. What does it mean to not see it? And then how do you get to, quote unquote, see the story when it seems it's so easy to the non writer to be like, well, they told you to write about gun suicide. How do you not see that? Right? Like, so what do you mean by seeing the story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a good question. I think in this particular case, what sometimes happens is we follow what kind of has been done or what's familiar. And so sometimes when you think and you follow, like even investigations and stuff, they kind of echo each other a little bit. And sometimes they feel like they follow a certain thread. And to sort of riff back to Eddie, what you were saying, that binary approach that you talked about, the two sort of talking points on the edges, of cold dead hands and AR-15 banning, that's what I would call sort of a binary approach or a construct of a piece, is an either or. And in that either or, you tend to fall out on the edges. And so it's either this or that. It's an extreme, sort of construct. And as I pulled back and sort of thought, and this includes my coverage over 20 years at the Journal Sentinel. And again, I was in Colorado Springs before that and covered the military out of Fort Carson and so forth. So this goes a long way. I've written about firearms in one way or another. And I fell into this a lot. And it's sort of there's another approach that was called back in the 90s civic journalism. Okay. So it's kind of fallen out of grace or whatever favor, but it's a messier version. It's leaning into the complexity. It's going into the middle where, I write about a coroner here in Wisconsin who was like, he's a Second Amendment guy and he votes Democrat, and he's in favor of a red flag law and he owns an AR-15, I'm like, dude, how do you even exist? Because according to everything I'm reading and looking on social media, you don't exist. Like, you're not a real thing. And he laughed, he's like, yeah, nobody really talks to me, but whatever, that's fine. And it was a funny moment, but it was like, that's what you started to find when you talk to people, is like, they're more complicated. And especially what social media does to me is it flattens people and it makes, they're more caricatured and they're more in this binary either or structure. So to be able to see the story simply requires partially, this sounds, I don't mean to be this insulting for any journalist. It is getting out from behind the computer and going and actually meeting people face to face. And I think when people come together, and you guys do these groups, emotion gets really hot, but human beings are human beings. And when together, even when they have really strong feelings on issues, there is often something that can come together that can bring us together, that's stronger, that is strongest, in the creative force I believe that's behind us all, that brings us together at some points. And in that ability to come together, I think that that's the key coming forward. And I think that a lot of what, and I'm in the media, and it's like, I'm not trying to speak, but, in the social media and so forth, actually counters that and blocks us off from our humanity and ultimately from actually some ideas that could really be out of the box and new. So for me, quote, seeing the story, it just all started with talking to people, which sounds Captain Obvious, but that's what it was. And then I started to understand, oh, this is beautifully complex and messy. It's awesome.
I'm seeing that a lot from some of the independent sources, like the Free Press jumps to mind, Barry Weiss's project, the less, I guess you could say the less legacy style journalistic stuff, because they go out and they conduct interviews. Maybe they don't go out as much, but they definitely conduct interviews over the phone, and they don't just write from a bunch of articles to synthesize into their own article. I'm starting to see more and more platforms popping up. We had Adam Coleman on, who founded Wrong Speak, and what he's done is he's given a forum for people to express their own personal angles on things too. I think that adds a flavor where there's less of an agenda, more of a storytelling. And it's just like, hey, this is me. I'm a person telling a story, and I think that's softened a lot of this. But I'd like for you to share a little bit, because I know Mike probably wants to talk about talking to the other side too, because we've had productive conversations about that. But if you wouldn't mind spending a little time discussing the broad picture of what journalism today in 2024 looks like, and how public sentiment has been very slanted against, I guess you could say, the media, right? The corporate media, the legacy media. And you're part of a Gannett organization. Gannett's huge. They've been around for a really long time. And we could lump them into legacy media, but you're giving a breath of hope and inspiration to me, at least, to say, this isn't necessarily always how it is. There's not a bunch of, writers out there pushing their own agendas, or the corporate agenda, or the political agenda. And I think we need more of that. But also, like, what's been your perspective over those 20 years, and do you see it shifting? Are people getting worn out of the clickbait stuff and the screaming BuzzFeed headlines, and are they more interested in the long form depth and analysis like what's offered through podcasting? And can we put that into print form, or are you also getting black pilled like the rest of us?
Yeah, lots changed. So I came into the business in, I'm like right at 30 years now, right? So I came in 93, grew up in Wisconsin here, started working in Kenosha in 93, Kenosha News, which is south of Milwaukee. A lot's changed, a huge amount. And a big part of it is the financial, piece behind this, just to give people, for people who don't know, newspapers were like money printing operations at one time. We know this. Like, if you ever tried to take out a classified ad to sell a bike, it cost you more to take out the ad than the bike was worth, right? That was like just rolling money off, and they were monopolies, and they just, and they were not always a very forward-looking operation. Like, they didn't anticipate the internet. They didn't anticipate some of the disruption. They didn't anticipate Craigslist, but it is hard to compete with free. So that's where a lot of the classified went away. So the money stream that came in was really important. And that's what has contributed to the loss, not only of, the overall journalists. We've lost, in terms of practicing journalists in this country, depending on how you count, we've lost more than 30% of the overall journalists, since like 2008. And what that looks like in some places is some rural areas, like no news operation at all. Nobody covering the city council or the village board or the school board. And that really, where the rubber meets the road, that really matters, because that's a big part of what we all count on. And that's, and that's what the framers had in mind when they gave great power, and it's an unbelievable amount of power in that First Amendment to the media to be able to go without having to worry about being, squashed like happens in other countries, especially like England and so forth. Sometimes when we partner with English media, we'll publish first because the libel laws are better. And it's like, well, are you trying to get around something? It's that governments will suppress news that they don't like. And people are like, well, like, who would be in favor of this? So, and I'm not here to like defend everything that's done as the media. And yet it's super duper important to have a strong, free media that's reporting on things, because just saying, like, the government would, politicians would be kind of happy to not have that scrutiny. And we see in places where they don't get it that things don't always really go so well. Now, that's the way it's laid out, and there isn't a lot of like rules around it. And that was on purpose, because it was like, we didn't want to give the government, who's the one that we're scrutinizing, the ability to license and the ability to control and, tell reporters like what they're doing right and wrong. And that ends up with a messy situation. What we have right now is a financial shaking out period, coupled with increased polarization, in my view, that's really been contributed by social media. So the economics have hugely changed. And what social media does is grabbed a lot of the money. If it was a closed amount of pie, they went from a zero slice to a big slice of the pie, and they're not sharing. So we do not get money from Facebook and other places, for our content. And So news operations, traditional news operations like Gannett, which is a huge newspaper company and website company, and others have really struggled. They have transitioned to the web, but it's a real struggle. And others have come in, nonprofit news operations that are funded. And that's always kind of a question, like, where's the funding from? And, how free are they to be able to report on anything? And then on the positive side, though, there's been a lot of like freeness to be able to like launch a podcast. Like, you don't need to go get a license to do a podcast or to be able to launch a blog or to be able to get out there. So there is something that's positive, in this sort of wide open, what the web provides. But there is, I think what people are looking for is they want to know is this real? Like, whatever your kind of take is, has this been
Right.
vetted? Is this somebody's opinion? And that's kind of what we do. And we aggregate and we curate. And when we're doing it well, it's not with bias and so forth. And I just agree that is a challenge that has come up, in our industry, and it's been identified. And I think we grapple with it a lot. And I think that there are people of good intention who are grappling with it now. And I think there is an appetite to what you're talking about, the longer form. I think there is reaching that audience and trying to find that audience to say, how can we reach you and engage in a deeper conversation? I think that's a challenge. You guys are doing it with your audience. We're trying to find different ways that we can reach out and say, hey, let's have a longer conversation. Let's get away from the quick clickbait. I sort of said this piece was like anti-clickbait, right? Because of this, the headlines and things like that were almost intentionally made to be not that. They were made to be very not grabby. I mean, there was some grab in them, I guess, but I mean, even the imagery, if you look, there's very few firearms in the imagery of the series. And that wasn't to suppress it. It was that it's about the people, behind the gun. So, but as I see some people promoting it, as I've done on interviews, the promotional video is like a rack of AR-15s. And I'm like, well, that's not really what the series was about. I mean, I talk about AR-15s a little bit in terms of ownership in Wisconsin and so forth, but it was like, that's sort of the default. And I don't think people even think about it. We interviewed a guy about guns. We better put a thing up about a bunch of guns. It's like, well, anyway, it's interesting to me that's kind of the approach. And I would probably have done this had I not had the gift of this time to really think, more deeply and talk to people like you guys about it.
John, have you found over the last 3 decades that people are more or less trusting or suspicious of talking to you?
That's a good question. I think more suspicious, more questioning, though I am surprised at how willing people are. Sometimes as I sit in my office, I can think that there's more distrust based on comments that I might see on social media. And again, I think kind of the big surprise is that that's like a fun house. Like, social media is like a fun house of mirrors. It's all this distortion, and you're not really seeing reality. And the problem is that, it's like a through the looking glass thing, because people's view of reality, it's like a cycle, is being shaped by a distorted view of reality. So then their view of reality is starting to, it's this making your head spin. It's too early in the morning, but it does cycle that way. And when you break out of that and go talk to people, again, it sounds sort of absurd at the beginning of this that I thought, would gun owners talk to me? But that's actually a real concern as I've talked to other people. One of the things from other journalists, they're like, how did you get so many gun owners to talk to you? I'm like, I don't know. I just called them, and then we went and met and talked. And part of it was people would ask, like, do you own guns? I mean, some people would say, I would say I'm, from the, I'm from the mainstream media, enemy of the people, whatever, like, we just make a joke about it. Okay, let's get on with it. Like, I mean, it was like, I guess when we started talking, not to discount people's views, but I was like, we can just talk as people. And then I guess maybe when I talked a little bit about the background, I guess, of covering the military and stuff like that. But I think actually any reporter, if you're willing to take the time And a lot of it is under pressure because we don't have time to always get out and do the interview. It takes more time to do that. To do something fast, like something off a crime thing and not ever leave the office, is just cheaper to do. And when you have a third less people, the operations are cheaper to do. And so that kind of stuff tends to be less nuanced, takes less time, and tends to be more distorted than what reality is. The world is a lot more complex. It takes more time to get out and find that complexity. But when people talk, like, that's how we communicate as human beings, is through story. To me, that's the major way that we, share, and we have for millennia, our shared experiences is through story. Well, you got to sit with somebody. I would argue in person, to be able to sit face to face, to be able to have that kind of experience.
Dan Patrick, who I think is one of the better interviewers, he has a little mocking thing, or I've listened to him for years, but he used to say, fast and wrong is still fast. And I think that's really unfortunate. That's how we're going. But even in our profession with telehealth and, the quick down and dirty 30-minute sessions and all that, that's a different topic for a different day. Eddie?
So I would like to go back to what you said in the beginning. Can you kind of talk about your process? Because you said you're currently not a gun owner, but you're thinking about becoming one. Can you go through your line of thinking? Because I think that might kind of resonate with some of the people who either read your piece, maybe find this, listen to this podcast, or something. Not everyone that listens to us is a gun owner, and maybe like the thoughts that are going through your head, and maybe why you're transitioning to, I think I'm going to become one, even though I'm not already one.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So this is probably going to be driven by circumstance. So my dad passed away recently, and I mentioned that he grew up hunting pheasant with this prize 22, and haven't spoken to my siblings yet. We're still going through the will and all that, but I think that gun will probably come to me, and as well as a shotgun that was his father's. And again, the property where he grew up and he used to hunt pheasants is still there. And actually, my son, who's now an adult, he was out there, and he doesn't have a gun, but he was hunting with a pellet gun out there, and which he had when he was way younger. And so so I think it's going to be probably a family thing in that case. But like I said, it was funny at the beginning. I would automatically say, like, yeah, I'm not a gun owner. And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, actually, I lived in a house, well, at least part-time, with a gun. And I learned about shooting from my dad in a way that is really a precious memory to me right now. And it'd mean a lot to be able to, go shoot that gun with some of the sources that I've done. Because, for the project, I did shoot with people a few times. I would go out and go to the range. Some of the interviews that I would do, I would say, well, what do you want to do? Let's shoot. Okay. That'd be a great way to do an interview, in between that. And again, when I covered the military, when I was overseas in Iraq with third Armored Cavalry Regiment, 10th Special Forces Group, I had the gift to be able to shoot a lot of interesting stuff, like, because it's the military, right? So like a Barrett sniper rifle, and shoot a 50 cal off a Bradley fighting vehicle, which was like, I was shooting. This was in a quick story in Kuwait, and I'm shooting this, and I'm shooting at a dumpster, like in the desert, and little different rules when they're overseas on where they can shoot and stuff. And I was shooting at this, double steel dumpster, and I'm seeing the sand come up, and I'm like, oh, I must be shooting high. And the soldier next to me is like, no, sir, you're shooting through the dumpster. It's like going through. And so that was like, wow, that was cool. I loaded an M1A2 Abrams tank. I was a loader one time, which is an amazing experience. Being a shell loader, they put the 19-year-olds in there to do that, and it just, like, the recoil on the gun in a Abrams is life-changing. So it's something that's always interested me in terms of firearms from when I was covering the military. That changed in like 2004. I came to Milwaukee, but then I covered law enforcement. So I would shoot a little bit with them. So it's really always been part of that. I think the ownership is going to come through this, gun or two for my dad, and then we'll just see where it goes.
What's funny is that while you're not a current gun owner, you've shot some stuff that is like a gun owner's wet dream in a sense when you were overseas. And I mean, I will say this: I'm sorry for the loss of your dad, but like the skill he must have had to be able to shoot a bird on the wing of a 22 is outstanding. So that is just kudos to him and just that whole family in that regard.
Thank you.
I had a question for you, John. You mentioned earlier that you learned a lot, like in your research about mental health, and we talked a lot about the gun side today, being that this is a guns and mental health podcast. What I'm wondering is, have you ever sought therapy before? And if so, was it helpful? If not, what is it that you do for your mental health?
I appreciate that question. Yeah, I do. I have sought mental health. I work with a counselor now, and periodically, and it's really been helpful. I'm going to utilize him. I'm utilizing him through the grieving with my dad. And we've had that in our family. We've had mental health challenges in our family. We've had crises. I'm even familiar with the emergency detention laws and that whole procedure, which is, back to the question of red flag laws. There is a firearms review as part of emergency detention, which you guys might be, I'm sure you're aware of. And that's interesting. So I've had that experience. And in terms of wellness, it is really a priority for me. I mean, for me, and it's changed. So I'm 53 now, going to be 54 later this year. And the things I did as a younger man, I do, differently now. But I take it very seriously. I had some things that happened health-wise, and just also just a series of things that it's hard to really pin down what it was. But that really, just for me, turned me much more deeply into my faith, and much more deeply into a faith community, and particularly Fellowship of Men and the Ministry of Men that I'm really grateful for out of Colorado. Those guys, some may be aware of this, but it's the Wild at Heart ministry. John Eldredge wrote a book in 2001 called Wild at Heart. And that for me, not endorsing that for anyone, but that for me has been a huge part. And the Fellowship of Men, particularly around that experience. And then the retreats, I do yearly retreats here in Wisconsin through that ministry where I pull back, detach from all media for that 4-day weekend. At least one of those a year, sometimes multiple parts of those are really important. And then just in the dailies, for me, I'm very conscious of staying connected with people, and also staying in scripture, and also journaling regularly, getting on my bike. That's one of the times that I hear from God, is getting on my bike and just sort of like riding it out, or splitting wood, which sounds like do you really do that? It's like, I really do. And have a big fire in the backyard. It's sort of like the man's man thing, but it really is, it's funny. Again, I'm sort of processing a lot of my dad's stuff. He gave me his maul years ago. He couldn't split wood anymore. So he said, you can have this to split wood. And so, so I think it's really something. And I really feel like actually, it's interesting. This whole project to me dovetails really well of how I've been, cared for and walking with men in recent years. Because when I came in and started to look at the numbers, and if you go on our website, you'll see that we got data from every county in Wisconsin, 72 counties. And I have line level data on a lot of those. We didn't publish line level data, but I have line level data, meaning I can see names of people who've taken their lives, and I can see the background, and it's overwhelmingly, particularly male, particularly white male over the age of 50. And so just really sobering to look at that data and to understand that if my, sort of ministry and purpose in this world is partially in that area, this project helps advance that in a really meaningful way.
You don't want to endorse Wild at Heart, but I will. I need to reread it because my wife just picked up Captivating, which is by John and Stacey Aldridge, and so she's reading that, which means I need to revisit Wild at Heart. It's an outstanding book, and it's a very easy read too. It's cool. Ghost Tactical says, always felt. Oh, but before I get to Ghost, yeah, and we do look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, Trey. Clovertex says one of the many reasons to become a responsible firearm owner, the community. We have a lot of friendly, helpful folks. The support you can get can be unlike anything else. See the growth of WTTA, for example. But Ghost says he's always felt like his mental health has been its strongest when physical health is strong. Is there a scientific correlation? And DB's back. It looks like he's got real internet now. You want to answer that?
Well, I think just in short, yes, there's a tremendous amount of data that supports that. So I'm not looking at the studies right now, but I just say that there's a tremendous amount of studies saying that physical health is a tremendous asset to mental health. I mean, a rising tide floats all boats. We don't compartmentalize from one aspect of health to another. We can certainly do that for a time, like so many things in life. We can run like my internet today has been running at high steam, and I'm still trying to manage on this side. But you can only do, that kind of multitasking for so long. So in general, absolutely. In fact, there's this isn't germane, certainly germane. There's a movement called Nature RX, and such a huge part of treatment for depression or anxiety can absolutely be just getting outside, doing some real things. And we've looked at, for example, ADHD studies or oppositional defiance disorder in children. And just by changing environment into a green outdoor space for a chunk of time each day has tremendous effect on reduction of ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, which if we follow a purely genetic model or a purely medical model, that shouldn't work. Well, trouble is, neither does their model. Swinging an axe, shooting guns, spending time with other men, if you're a man, that does have a strong effect. And so being physically fit absolutely is part of our overall health. I'm so encouraged to hear, John, what you were sharing toward this latter, well, the entire thing, but this latter part in particular, and that the book recommendation. I just want to throw another one out there. Michael Foster's book, It's Good to Be a Man. Tremendous book. It's good to be a woman as well, but every now and then it's kind of nice to hear that it's good to be a man. And there's responsibility and accountability for that. And we can each step to the plate and come together as men. And I think we build a stronger society when each of us isn't looking to find out what's wrong with somebody else, but rather what can I do and how can I be better and stronger? And we take it from an honest position like that. And I think it's not as clickbaity, but it's the stuff that we actually need. So I thoroughly appreciate the conversation for those hanging with me as I drop in and out of the channel.
Yeah. Just for the record, getting outdoors in brown, which is Nevada, also works. It doesn't have to be green; it can be brown. Eddie, you do this regularly in your job.
Yeah, that's I wanted to talk about that. My entire job is in a sense based around the kind of outdoor therapy. We don't exactly do wilderness therapy, which has like a negative connotation, or like kind of like they somewhat kidnap kids in some ways and ship them off to places for an undisclosed amount of time. I have worked in wilderness therapy, and I do think it does work, but it has some negative connotations to it. But like the whole outdoor therapy side of it, we do a lot of challenge by choice. We put kids up in situations where they can challenge them. It could be rock climbing, whitewater rafting. Some of it's just fishing and going on hikes. It's the idea of it is just they're outside of, they're away from their phones, they're outside of the school building, and kids can, one, just be kids, and two, the fresh air is just, it's amazing to see what Dr. DB was saying, a super ADHD kid, all of a sudden we just put him in nature and just let him kind of vibe out just because he's surrounded by seeing, I don't know, a bunny or a deer or something. I know for myself personally, there's some of the kids that I work with, they're a lot of rednecky kids, and I, vibe a lot with that because I'm not exactly a rednecky kid, but I'm definitely a country kid at heart. I do a lot of hunting, I do a lot of shooting. And so I've taken some of the kids to the range. Like I can't officially take them there due to, insurance purposes, but I can 100% say, hey, we're going to go to the archery range today. And if you want to meet me over there, we'll hang out.
And no screens, right? Like we now have tons and tons and tons of data on promoted by Jonathan Haidt, who I'd love to get on this podcast for sure to talk about what he's doing, because almost nobody knows about it. But we know that social media is so highly correlated with teen mental illness starting around 2012 that it's actually more highly correlated than lead poisoning is to brain damage. He's got those data, and getting him away from the screens and getting him out into nature is exactly what we need. Poor Brandon. He's in Ohio. It's just gray. He says lots and lots of gray.
Where
And rust,
dreams
right? That's the rust belt.
No, but like on that point, look at the work of Devin Perkins with Kids to Kings, and he's taking
Absolutely
kids right out of the inner city that someone would have never seen a mountain, and putting them in that environment, and that works wonders. They love it, right? The mothers love that. So there's definitely something to it. One thing I want to ask John before we wrap up is, mechanically, how did the USA Today thing work? I mean, I was so excited when I saw, what posted in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and then, to get that a month later or whatever, you're saying, hey, this is going to run in the USA Today. How does that work?
Well, I wish we could say we all planned it and this was exactly the way it worked, but here's how it went. Is that so? We're owned by Gannett Corporation. It's like the largest newspaper company in the world. USA Today is the flagship. We're Journal Sentinel, among other papers, has been acquired by Gannett over the years. So we operate independently. We're part of this corporation. And then Gannett is just like, or USA Today is just like the biggest reach paper, out there that goes national. And so occasionally when big projects come along, or stories of all various sizes, USA Today will pick those up for the website or the print edition. And this particular project, again, it's just, my wife and I were talking about it. It was just mind blowing how this whole thing came together. Because I will just say this too, is that the writing of this, I really have to give credit to the spirit beyond me that helped bring this in. Because these stories that I brought together in the time that it came, in the selection and the stories and how to tell them, were just, my wife's in this business too. And we just marveled at how it just really felt like we had a invisible helper. I'll just put it at that, behind all of this work. And that transmitted to USA Today, in that we didn't even really pitch them really hard on going into the print edition. But we said, hey, we got this project. And they said, yeah, we may pick a part of it for the print. And somebody within their organization, we don't know who, came back and said, well, we see this really Wisconsin-based story. I assume because it was Wisconsin-based, not probably interested in them. But they said, yeah, we want to really shrink down the Wisconsin version because that doesn't really translate to a national audience. But we really think these 5 features that featured you guys, and that featured the coroner that I mentioned, that featured the gun shop owner and the sergeant major, and then the mom whose son died by gun suicide, that those speak to everybody, that those are universal across the country. So what we'd like to do is run them in full. I mean, I'm just breathtaking, in a 6-page special section, no ads, the whole thing. And I was like, I wish we could have planned this to say, yeah, here's 5 features in a main story. That fits perfectly. Why don't you put that in your special section? That wasn't our idea. That's just what we wrote, which just magically fit exactly in their template of what they needed. And somebody within USA Today, and again, I think that's where people will be like, well, the media or liberal media or whatever can't see this. Well, somebody there saw it. And they made the decision. We did not have to argue for this. Somebody within that group at that organization said, look, we want to make this major move. We want to make this major splash with this special section. And that's how it happened.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. And I really appreciate you coming in, John. We do takeaways on this version of the podcast. The one that Mike and I host when we just do more intimate interviews, we ask, how do you tend to your mental health? And you've already answered that, which is very cool. But I'm going to start with the takeaway. Mine is that I have a renewed enthusiasm and sense of hope for journalism broadly and for the Fourth Estate. to do what it's always been meant to do because of the balance and nuance that you presented in covering this topic that can be rife with landmines and emotionality. So that's my takeaway. I'm hopeful. I'm really, really hopeful. And DB, before his internet crashes again, what's your takeaway?
Well, I think that the simple solution is often not the solution being sought in the first place, and so I really appreciate the focus on that. That these are complex human issues, and they aren't solved by one kind of quick, soundbite solution. And when that's sought, it really, really creates divides. It creates challenges, and if that's the goal, then that's, I suppose, then at least we're calling it what it is, and we might be honest about that. And so I really appreciate when journalism takes the time, when journalists take the time to dig into that, because I think that's what people want to hear. I recall so many things in the last 3 years that I really wanted to hear other people's thoughts about it, and not just two sides to something. And I can pick my own uneducated thought on something by myself, and so I really appreciate when people take the time to look at the different sides, and then make me do some work in that, and think about what I actually haven't thought about. And so to the journalists who are willing to do that, and John, you certainly are among that crowd. Much appreciation.
Brandon, what are you taking away?
Sorry, I was having trouble getting off of mute there. No, similar to
Good
DB,
take,
I
Brandon.
think just
Good take.
Thank you. So similar to what DB was saying, I think just going back to that conversation we had about how things we don't really see a lot of change from the top down. It comes from the bottom to the top. So that's why I really appreciate, John, what you're doing, with your investigative journaling. And that's what I appreciate about being a part of this organization, is that, the more work that we do down at the bottom, the closer we can get to chipping towards the top and making a real difference.
Eddie, then Mike and John can close this up.
See, Brandon, this is how you turn the mute off immediately.
Thank you.
Anyways, first off, John, I want to appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today, and just taking the time actually to do this story. So many times, I think, myself personally, I definitely, as you probably heard my little outtakes earlier, it's hard not to get jaded when you're looking at these nuanced issues, just because of how society polarizes these things. And by you stepping in and doing a story like this, it really does kind of help bring to light the stuff that everyone in this room knows is how we move forward with these things. The issue is not polar. It is a very nuanced issue that there are solutions for it. It just takes time. So I guess my my takeaway from this is kind of just same thing. Not let the negative get to you, in a sense, because this whole conversation has been about that. While the future may seem bleak at times, there's definitely answers and there's ways to take things forward, and kind of just take that more to my heart. Kind of the same things I kind of teach my clients, I have to teach myself at times.
I forgot about our illustrious Kevin Barry, marketing expert. What's your takeaway?
Yeah, I kind of echo everything else has said. It's going to be the long road, like John talked about. The quick, simple fix that maybe gets a big grant fundraising for a big advertising campaign isn't going to fix it long term. And we just got to kind of keep grinding away and keep working towards it. But it was great just seeing kind of the behind the scenes of the process and how it gets elevated to USA Today and all of it.
All right. So my takeaway, John, thank you so much for everything you've done. It's funny. I look back now and think about all the emails we exchanged months before we even made it out to USCCA, and then to see it where it is now. And you're just an awesome guy. And even when we finished with the interview, I remember turning to Jake and I'm like, that went really well. I like him. You know what I mean? And it's like I said, I've been in this industry since '98. I'm just so happy. I love proving my own people wrong. I do, as much as I love proving that people that doubt me wrong. Like when they say oh, the media, you can't trust them. And, I think back to the time, I was asked once to go on Pierce Morgan's show, and this is a long time ago. This is right after Sandy Hook, and I wasn't ready. You know, I knew I wasn't ready to go on there, and especially as a no-win situation for someone like me to go on there. Looking back on it now, I'd love to go on there, you know, at any time through anything with what I've done with WTTA. But, you know, I always would tell that story to people, and they're like, you can't trust the media. You can't do this to the media. And I just don't want to hear it anymore from the Second Amendment crowd, like that defeated attitude, you know, like, oh, you can't talk to them. You can't trust them. Yes, you can. You know what I mean? You got to know what you're talking about. You got to have a purpose. You got to have a solution. And my biggest takeaway from this is I want people to understand that there are reporters out there like John who will listen to you and give you a fair shake. I mean, he said, I grew up around guns, but he's not the 2A guy. It doesn't have to be a 2A reporter. It could be somebody that totally doesn't understand that lifestyle, maybe doesn't even agree with it, but they'll still give you a fair shake. We have proven time after time that we have not gotten bad press from anybody outside of our circle. I mean, we're big in the echo chamber, of course, but the moments where we've been able to step out of it, it's all been positive. So like everybody on here said, enough with the negative. Let's start focusing on some of the positives and maybe elevate the people within the community to get out there. Like the Second Amendment community, the gun manufacturers, we need to do a better job of telling the stories that we have that are positive. You can't tell me that there aren't PR firms that, you know, you put some of like Kids to Kings and all these other people with and help us pay for that because we don't, as nonprofits, we don't have the money. That to me would go a long way, especially if we wanted to break through to mainstream media. So John, thank you. I appreciate you.
John, your turn. Wrap us up, please.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, just really grateful for this opportunity for all of you, for the viewers and the commenters and so forth. So I just really, and you know, and again, we talk about the email chains that we had, Mike going back and Jake, you coming in then. I mean, it takes a level of trust, you know, to work with a reporter, and I don't take that for granted. And to be able to tell somebody's story is a really sacred thing. That's what I feel like that's been my calling in life so far. And I just really thank you guys for everything you've done here today and earlier. I do want to say that, and I love the shout out to Wild at Heart, man. And I will just say, I do want to endorse that like you did, Jake, because it's been a huge part of my life. And just being able to share this time talking about not only what's passionate for you guys, just about what's wellness has been really encouraging. I come out of this project and out of this conversation hopeful. And I'll tell you, that was when I talked to people as I got into this project, people who I would say, I have friends who are pretty strongly anti-gun, and to hear a message of hope, and you guys talk about that, is so needed in this space. It's so needed because people are looking for something to hold on to because even with the strong feelings, you can't live in that binary toxic space, whatever side your side is. So I actually think there is something that started here. You guys have detected it earlier than I had, but I think we might see the fruit of this for some years. It might be something where we're all in our 60s and 70s, and you could look back and say, but I think something is starting to change. And I think that there is, and I think it's going to come down to people just coming together. And like you guys said, maybe getting away from some of the filters and the screens and the divisive stuff and just seeing each other as people first. And, and handling the complexity, and people are okay. They can handle the complexity. But just seeing people's humanity first and seeing all you guys has just been a real joy. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate everybody stopping by, especially the people live on YouTube. You guys have always been there, G-Webs and CloverTac and Ghost. We really appreciate you. And on behalf of our platinum sponsors, Arms Corps, Ruger, USCCA, Chattanooga Shooting Sports. I'm missing somebody. Who am I missing? Somebody help me out here. My brain is dead. NASGW, of course. NASGW. that make this possible, right? We would love for more people to jump on board. So if you would like to sponsor at a high level, definitely helps make the world go round. So thanks for everybody joining in. Thanks for you guys, committing your time this morning. Well, it's lunchtime and, a couple of locations, I guess. But have a wonderful weekend. Happy New Year to everybody. And we wish you all great mental wellness. Bye-bye.